Motor Vessel Touska, Motor Vessel Touska, vacate your engine room. We are prepared to subject you to disabling fire. 3 seconds of silence on the radio. Then the 5-inch gun fires. What you're about to see is not a scenario. On April 19, 2026, USS Spruance, a guided missile destroyer armed with enough firepower to sink a fleet, fired live rounds into an Iranian cargo ship that refused to stop. What was on that ship, and why did its crew choose to defy the most powerful navy on Earth? This is the full story. Built from official CENTCOM statements, open-source intelligence, and declassified Navy doctrine. To understand what happened in the Gulf of Oman on April 19th, you need to understand what the United States actually built out there over the past 6 days. On April 13, 2026, following the collapse of negotiations in Islamabad, U.S. Central Command activated a full naval blockade of Iranian ports. The order was precise. No vessel bound for or departing an Iranian port would pass. The Abraham Lincoln Strike Group, anchored around the Strait of Hormuz, became the enforcement arm of that decision. Within 24 hours, the blockade was costing Iran an estimated $400 million per day in lost oil revenue. Within 5 days, more than 24 commercial vessels had been redirected or turned back without a single shot fired. By the time the Touska made its move, that number had reached 25. That tells you something important. The system was working. Most captains, when challenged by a guided missile destroyer, do the rational thing. They turn around. The Touska did not. The MV Touska is a Panamax container vessel, nearly 900 feet long, operated by Hafiz Darya Shipping Line, a subsidiary of the Islamic Republic of Iran Shipping Lines, known as IRISL. That matters because IRISL is not a regular commercial carrier. The U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control has had IRISL and its subsidiaries under active sanctions for years, specifically for transporting goods that support Iran's military and nuclear programs. The Touska was not a neutral ship caught in the wrong place. It was a vessel already on Washington's radar. Its recent movements made it more suspicious, not less. In late March, the Touska departed Zhuhai, China, a port that the Washington Post had previously identified as a key transshipment point where Iran secures precursor chemicals for ballistic missile propellant. For 2.5 days during that voyage, the ship's AIS transponder, the maritime equivalent of a flight transponder, went dark. Turning off AIS is a violation of international maritime law. It is also a documented tactic used by Iran's shadow fleet to obscure cargo origins and destinations. On April 12th, the Touska was tracked, leaving Port Klang, Malaysia, another well-documented hub for Iranian sanctions evasion, and setting course into the Arabian Sea. Its declared destination: Bandar Abbas, Iran's largest commercial and naval port. It had 6 days to turn around. It didn't. Here is what the U.S. Navy's Escalation of Force doctrine looks like in practice, because this is not a protocol that begins with cannon fire. The doctrine is called EOF, Escalation of Force. It is a graduated response framework that governs every maritime interdiction the U.S. military conducts. Think of it as a ladder. The Navy climbs one rung at a time and only moves up when the vessel below fails to comply. At the bottom, radio contact, then visual signals, then warning flares, then maneuvering the warship to block the route. Then, and only then, disabling fire, targeting non-critical systems to stop the vessel without sinking it or killing its crew. The engine room is the textbook aim point. Disable propulsion, immobilize the ship, preserve the crew. Waiting in reserve throughout this entire process is the Visit, Board, Search, and Seizure Team, the VBSS. In this case, that team was the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit, embarked aboard the amphibious assault ship USS Tripoli, operating nearby in the Arabian Sea. VBSS Marines are trained specifically for ship seizures, fast roping and rappelling onto vessels underway, securing the bridge and cargo spaces under hostile or uncertain conditions, conducting forensic-grade cargo inspections. They are not a boarding party in the 18th century sense. They are a precision interdiction force. The Spruance and the Tripoli were not improvising. This was a coordinated operation. The destroyer handles the intercept and the enforcement action. The amphibious ship provides the strike force. The moment the Touska failed to comply, a clock started. Marines were already on helicopters. And that brings us to the last piece of this machinery, because understanding what Spruance was about to do to that ship changes how you see everything that follows. The Mark 45 5-inch gun is not a warning system. It is a naval artillery piece designed to engage surface targets, aircraft, and shore installations. A standard projectile weighs 32 kilograms and travels at nearly 800 meters per second. When aimed at an engine room, it is not firing warning shots. It is conducting a precision strike against a specific compartment to disable propulsion without destroying the hull or killing the crew. Not a sinking, a disabling, not a kill shot, an arrest. That distinction, surgical, proportional, documented, is the entire legal and strategic logic of what was about to happen. If you want to understand how America projects power at sea, subscribe to Operation Fury. We deploy new analysis every week. Inside the Spruance's Combat Information Center, operators were tracking the Touska on radar, monitoring its AIS signal, which had come back online for this leg of the voyage, and calculating its projected course directly into the blockade zone. At 17 knots, a vessel that size has significant momentum. Stopping it isn't a switch you flip. It's a process you initiate early enough to matter. The first radio calls went out on Channel 16, the international distress and hailing frequency, the Touska's call sign, the legal basis for the intercept, the instruction to alter course, professional, precise, documented. Every word of it recorded. There was no compliance. The Touska held course, heading northeast toward the Strait of Hormuz. 6 hours is an extraordinarily long window for a maritime interdiction. Most are resolved in under an hour. What the Spruance's crew was doing in that time was not waiting. They were building a legal record. Every warning logged, every non-response documented, every escalation step confirmed and recorded, because what happens diplomatically and legally in the aftermath depends entirely on that paper trail. The U.S. military was not just stopping a ship. It was constructing an airtight case for seizure. There is a question every officer in that CIC was asking by hour 3. Why isn't this ship stopping? The manifest is one answer. A vessel with 2.5 days of missing AIS data near a rocket fuel procurement site doesn't reverse course easily. Not if the cargo is what the routing suggests, and not if the consequences of returning empty-handed are worse than the consequences of being intercepted. But there's a second answer, and it's more dangerous. Someone above the captain gave the order to hold course. Not a commercial decision, a strategic one. Iran knew the ceasefire had 4 days left. A seized civilian vessel, broadcast globally as American aggression, was worth more as propaganda than as delivered cargo. The Touska didn't stop. So Spruance climbed the last rung. After more than 6 hours of contact, the commanding officer authorized disabling fire. The final radio call went out. Vacate the engine room. The crew had 60 seconds. They evacuated. The gun fired. CENTCOM released the footage. You can see the rounds impact the stern section of the Touska. The engine room sits aft on vessels of this class, housing the main propulsion diesel engines and the drive shaft. 3 to 4 rounds from the Mk-45, correctly aimed, are sufficient to destroy the main engine or sever the shaft entirely. A Panamax container vessel with no propulsion is a very large, very expensive piece of steel that goes nowhere. The Touska went dead in the water. 40 kilometers away, aboard the USS Tripoli, engines were already running. The 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit had been on standby throughout the standoff. Now the helicopters launched, MH-60S Seahawks, carrying a VBSS team equipped for a ship seizure in contested conditions. What they were flying into was unknown. The Touska's crew had evacuated the engine room as instructed, which suggested some level of cooperation. But a 900-foot container ship has hundreds of compartments. The cargo was unverified. There could be armed personnel aboard. The Marines had authority to treat it as a hostile environment until proven otherwise. The helicopters reached the Touska and held position above the deck. Then the rappel lines went down. Marines fast-roped onto the deck of a dead ship in the middle of the Arabian Sea, secured the bridge, and took the crew into custody. Iran's military command would later state that the crew did not resist because family members were aboard. Sit with that for a moment. The Iranian regime sent a sanctions-flagged vessel carrying suspected military cargo into an active blockade zone, with civilian family members on the crew. If that's accurate, it tells you everything about how Tehran values the people it puts on these missions. Once the bridge was secured, the inspection began. And here is where the story is still being written. As of this recording, CENTCOM and the U.S. Treasury have not released the official cargo manifest. What Reuters maritime security sources have described is probable cause for what they call dual-use items, goods with both civilian and military applications, sourced from Asia. That description is consistent with the Touska's routing. Zhuhai, China, where Iran is documented as procuring rocket propellant precursors, then Port Klang, Malaysia, a known sanctions evasion hub, then straight into the blockade zone. A 4,695 container capacity ship making that route with AIS dark for 2.5 days near a rocket fuel procurement site and refusing to stop for 6 hours when a U.S. destroyer told it to. That is not a ship carrying agricultural equipment. What was on the Touska will likely determine whether this incident becomes a historical footnote or the most significant seizure in the blockade's history. What do you think was on that ship? Weapons components, oil, or something else entirely? Drop your theory in the comments. And when CENTCOM releases the manifest, we'll break it down on this channel. The moment the Marines secured the Touska, the political fallout began moving faster than the ship ever did. Iran's Khatam al-Anbiya Central Headquarters, the body that commands Iran's military operations, issued a statement within hours calling the seizure an act of piracy and a violation of the ceasefire. Hours later, Iranian state media reported drone strikes against U.S. vessels in the Gulf of Oman. CENTCOM reported no damage. The drone launches appear to have been a demonstration rather than a serious attack, Iran signaling that it had not surrendered its ability to respond while stopping well short of an action that would justify a kinetic U.S. answer. The more consequential response was diplomatic and tactically revealing. Iran's foreign ministry announced it would not send negotiators to Islamabad. Read that carefully. Iran chose to cancel peace talks rather than absorb the seizure quietly. That's not the response of a regime that thinks it's winning. That's a regime that needed a public grievance more than it needed a deal. The ceasefire expires. Wednesday. Iran just handed Washington a documented provocation to point to if it doesn't. The seizure of the Touska fits into a larger pattern that the blockade has been designed to force. Make non-compliance so costly that the Iranian government must choose between its economic survival and its strategic posture in the strait. The math here is not subtle. 26 vessels intercepted. 25 complied without force. The Touska chose differently and is now in American custody, its cargo being examined by U.S. investigators its sanctions history documented in the legal record. Iran is watching its oil revenue evaporate at $400 million per day. The oil fields themselves are under threat of permanent damage if the overflow situation continues past April 26th. For the U.S. Navy, the operation was textbook. A 6-hour escalation protocol executed by the book, disabling fire that was precise, proportional, and non-lethal to the crew. A rapid response VBSS team that secured the vessel without casualties. CENTCOM footage released within hours, demonstrating the entire sequence publicly. This was power projection designed to be seen. Every commercial captain in the Arabian Sea watched what happened to the Touska and recalculated their risk. The Touska has become the most persuasive argument the U.S. Navy has made in weeks. Not with a speech, not with a sanction. With 3 rounds from a 5-inch gun into an engine room in the middle of the Arabian Sea, 25 ships turned around. The 26th is in American custody. The Touska seizure is not the end of this story. It may be the moment that determines whether it ends at all. A ceasefire expires Wednesday. Iran's military has already launched drones at U.S. ships and promised a response is coming. The Strait of Hormuz, the passage that moves 25% of the world's seaborne oil, remains a controlled choke point with no diplomatic solution in sight. Here is what that means concretely. The Abraham Lincoln Strike Group is operating in waters where Iran has ballistic missiles pre-targeted at surface ships, a drone arsenal that can saturate point defenses, and every reason to demonstrate that seizing the Touska had a cost. If the ceasefire collapses Wednesday and Tehran decides the answer is a mass strike on the strike group, the U.S. Navy's response will make what happened to the Touska look like a warning shot. The U.S. Navy has demonstrated it will enforce this blockade with live fire. Iran has demonstrated it will not simply accept that, and somewhere between those two positions, the ceasefire that expires in 72 hours is either going to hold or it isn't. What happens if it doesn't hold and Iran retaliates against the Abraham Lincoln Strike Group is the scenario we are covering next. Subscribe to Operation Fury and hit the bell, because when that ceasefire expires Wednesday, you won't want to be behind on what comes next.